40 years ago, a game came out for the Macintosh that was unlike almost anything else on a home computer. This was Dark Castle, an arcade-style action game where you control a hero who stumbles, climbs, jumps, and gets knocked around like something out of a cartoon. Your goal is simple: make it through 14 deadly rooms and topple the castle's ruler, the Black Knight. Guards patrol, birds swoop, and mutants wander through a castle that never seems to sit still. Then there's the sound, that opening Bach music, cartoonish sound effects, a castle that feels alive. Today, a black and white Macintosh game can look primitive at a glance, but in 1986, computer games weren't supposed to look, sound, or move like this. And yet Dark Castle did. So how did this happen? And how did it happen on a Macintosh? In 1986, the difference between an arcade machine and a home computer was obvious the moment you saw them side by side. Arcade hardware was designed around games. Motion, color, sound, and spectacle were the whole point. These machines had to grab your attention from across a noisy room and convince you to put in a quarter. Home computers lived in a different world. An Apple II, an IBM PC, or a Commodore 64 had to do more than just play games. They were used for school, business, programming, writing, and whatever else people could make them do. Some of those machines were great for games in their own way. The Commodore 64 especially had hardware that developers used brilliantly. But every home computer came with compromises. Animation could be limited, sound could be sparse, and the hardware often shaped how the game looked and behaved in ways that players could feel. That is the world Dark Castle appeared in. The Macintosh was a different kind of impressive. When Apple introduced the Mac, the focus was on the graphical interface. Windows, icons, a mouse, a sharp black and white screen that made text, drawing, and menus look incredibly clean. For artists and software designers, that screen was a gift. For arcade-style action, it created problems. The Mac had no color, no hardware sprites, and no built-in way to move characters around the screen. It was designed around a beautiful interface, not full-screen animation. The early Mac game scene was still small, too. A lot of games from those first years were clever, experimental, or charming, but they usually did not push towards fast, animated action. So Dark Castle arrived on a machine with two conflicting qualities. It could make black and white artwork look beautiful, but it made action difficult, and the game was built around both. At the center of all this is Prince Duncan, although calling him a prince almost makes him sound more capable than he is. He starts his adventure in the Great Hall of the castle, and is sent through different doors, each one leading to a new room full of traps, enemies, and small problems to solve. Dark Castle plays like a side view action adventure. You climb ropes, jump gaps, dodge hazards, throw rocks, and try to survive rooms full of bats, guards, and worse. But the way it controls is unusually physical. You move the hero with the keyboard, while the mouse controls the angle of his arm. So when you throw a rock, you're not just pressing fire. You're aiming his whole little body at whatever horrible thing is about to attack him. The shield and fireball give you more options, but Dark Castle is notoriously difficult, built around timing, spacing, and learning how each room works. That is what gives Dark Castle its personality. Every screen feels like a trap, a puzzle, and a cartoon gag waiting to happen. To understand how Dark Castle came together, you have to go back to an era where the rules of computer game development were still being written. In the mid-80s, computer game development had not settled into the massive industry it would become. A game might be built by one person, or two, or three. The roles were loose. The process was improvised. There was no internet, no shared cloud folder, no instant build going out to the whole team. Most of the people making computer games were programmers or engineers first. They could create amazing things, but dedicated artists were only beginning to become part of the process in a serious way. Dark Castle came from that short window, before those roles had fully locked into place. A tiny team could make something deeply personal. An artist could shape the feel of the whole game. A programmer could bend the hardware around that vision. And if the team was working remotely, collaboration meant something very literal. You mailed the disc. That is where Mark Pierce enters the story. Before Dark Castle, Silicon Beach had released Airborne, an early Macintosh game with impressive digitized sound, but much simpler visuals. For its next project, the company wanted someone who could give the game a stronger artistic identity. Silicon Beach's producer and audio programmer, Eric Zocher, discovered Mark's work through the sample animations and artwork included with VideoWorks, an early Macintosh animation program. The animations were signed MSP for Mark Stephen Pierce, and they looked far beyond most early Mac graphics. Mark had been experimenting with computer animation since art school, and later helped create VideoWorks itself. So Silicon Beach founder Charlie Jackson flew him from Chicago to San Diego to discuss their next game. The company already had an idea involving a soldier traveling through different time periods, and Mark thought it was incoherent. Instead, he began storyboarding a medieval adventure almost on the spot, a quest against the Black Knight. A room inspired by Donkey Kong, swinging ropes with a little pitfall energy, vultures gathering and diving like enemies in Galaga. By the end of the meeting, the foundation of Dark Castle was there. This was not someone brought in at the end to make a programmer's game look better. In the mid-80s, many computer games were still created almost entirely by programmers. Mark belonged to a newer generation of artists who shaped the game from the beginning. He designed the rooms, characters, animation cycles, and much of its personality. Duncan's clumsy movement, comedic deaths, and exaggerated reactions gave the entire game a body language. Mark drew the artwork in Mac Paint and built the animation cycles in VideoWorks, mapping out every movement frame by frame. Dark Castle looked alive because it was designed by someone thinking like an animator, but all that animation still had to become a game. That job fell to Silicon Beach programmer Jonathan Gay, and here's the strange part. After their first meeting, Mark and Jonathan were separated by nearly 2,000 miles. Mark returned to Chicago, where he created the room designs, character graphics, and animation cycles. He saved them to floppy disk and mailed them across the country to Jonathan in San Diego. Jonathan incorporated those fragments into the game's 68,000 assembly code, then mailed a playable build back. Mark would try it, study what worked, and return another floppy disk with precise instructions. Before shared folders and instant downloads, Dark Castle was being assembled one floppy disk at a time. And somehow, that slow physical process produced a game built around speed, timing, and immediate reactions. Of course, none of this would matter if the Macintosh could not actually run it. That was Jonathan Gay's problem. The early Mac was not built like an arcade board. It did not have hardware sprites ready to move characters around the screen. It was a general-purpose computer with a beautiful display, but fast game animation was not what it was designed for. Jonathan developed Dark Castle on an Apple Lisa, using mostly 68,000 assembly language with a little Pascal for things like high scores. The tools were primitive, the debugging environment was limited, and flicker was a major problem. If the screen redraws while the player is watching it, animation can flash, tear, or feel unstable. For a game like Dark Castle, where so much depends on smooth movement and precise timing, that would have ruined the effect. Jonathan solved it with hardware page flipping, a method Apple only vaguely documented and did not officially support through the operating system. In plain English, the Mac could prepare one screen while showing another, then switch between them fast enough to create smooth full-screen motion. That was the trick that let Mark's animation become a playable game. Then there was the sound. Eric Zocher had already pushed Macintosh audio further than expected with Airborne. That work with Airborne gave Eric the foundation for Dark Castle, where sound became a much bigger part of the game's personality. Silicon Beach brought in Dick Noel, a semi-retired professional voice actor with a recording studio in his home. Eric arrived with an early version of the game and showed him the characters and their animations. Noel needed very little direction. He watched the vultures gather and dive, the mutants shuffle around, and Duncan stumble through the castle, then improvised voices and strange little sounds to match. After only an hour or two, they had a tape filled with possible character performances. These sounds gave every creature a personality. They also completed Duncan's transformation into a cartoon character. Run him into a wall, and he spins around dazed. Step off a ledge, and he hangs in the air, looks down, and falls with a cry. And it captured exactly what made Duncan feel like a cartoon character. Bringing all of that together required a company willing to give this small team room to experiment. Silicon Beach Software was small, but it was not careless. This was a young Mac software company filled with people who understood the platform, cared about presentation, and were willing to let unusual ideas take shape. Charlie Jackson gave Mark and Jonathan room to work. The game was not being pushed through a rigid production pipeline, so the small team could make decisions quickly and keep chasing the level of polish Dark Castle depended on. Even the packaging and presentation treated it like something special. And because it arrived so early in the Macintosh's life, it stood out even more. The right people, right machine, right moment. Dark Castle had proven what this small team could do. For the sequel, Silicon Beach widened the scope. Beyond Dark Castle gave Duncan bombs, a health bar, a way to save progress, and a much larger world to explore. It added larger scrolling areas, including labyrinths and helipack flights through forests and swamps, pushing the game beyond the tight room-by-room structure of the original. The sequel showed that Dark Castle was no lucky accident. The team had created a distinct kind of Macintosh action game, and now they were seeing how far they could take it. Other great Macintosh games would come later, but Dark Castle arrived early, when the Mac was still trying to prove what kind of machine it could be, and people noticed. Players and reviewers at the time did not treat it like a small curiosity. They noticed the animation, the sound, the polish, the way it felt closer to an arcade game than most people expected from a black and white Macintosh. That is why its reputation lasted. Dark Castle did not need to change the entire game industry for its place in history to be clear. Its importance is more specific than that. It became one of the signature early Macintosh games because it made the platform feel capable of something surprising. The Mac could be a serious creative tool. It could be a friendly home computer. It could be a strange little black and white art machine. And for a moment, with Dark Castle, it could also feel like an arcade. And now, as Dark Castle approaches its 40th anniversary, the original Macintosh versions of Dark Castle and Beyond Dark Castle are being brought back with new releases on Steam. For years, the original Macintosh versions became harder to experience the way they were meant to be played. The hardware aged, the software aged, the Mac itself moved on. And little by little, one of the platform's defining games became something most people remembered through old machines, emulation, screenshots, and stories. Bringing Dark Castle and Beyond Dark Castle back gives these games another chance to be understood on their own terms, because Dark Castle represents a very specific moment. A young platform, a tiny team, a dedicated artist, a sharp programmer, and a sound designer, all pushing a black and white Macintosh further than it seemed ready to go. 40 years later, that is still the magic of it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks so much for your time today. Goodbye.